Thank you, Charlie, for that very sweet introduction. And thank you all for having me. I'm Aisha Ahmad, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share some of my research, insights, thoughts, and ideas with you today. I am going to talk about my book, but actually, my journey here with you will start with the book and then bring you right into the next generation of the research that I'm working on now. Because I have been doing this for what feels like a long time, although I should be careful saying that. This is seniors college, and I'm still a relatively early career researcher. Um, I'll also like to speak just for a moment. Charlie, you asked about why I'm alive, and I'm going to say, in the 10 years when I was going in and out of various parts of the world that are full of conflict, my experience of those places was I was not scared. I was exceptionally well taken care of by very generous, kind, hospitable people who are just like you and me, but living under terrible circumstances, and I found that that taught me a great deal. And all of my research is indebted to brilliant, kind, wonderful people around the world who shared with me their stories of what has happened to their countries, why it has unfolded in the way it has, and what their lives were like and what agency they had under these very tough conditions. Now, Charlie, you are right. I started out, with this book, Jihad and Company: Black Markets and Islamist Power, and this topic that I'm presenting today: why jihadists win. Yes. How is that? Yay. Okay. Great. I definitely want everyone to be able to hear. Um, so this book asked the question about why jihadists win in the first instance. And it emerged out of observations I had, not just from the part of the world where I'm from. I'm from Peshawar, Pakistan. And when I was quite young, I do recall the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan in the 1990s. And then in 2006, when I was a new PhD student, I witnessed not directly, but while I was working on Somalia, there was the uh, takeover of the Islamic Courts Union in Somalia. And so this book that was born out of my dissertation research, um, it was really about the origin stories of why these jihadists were winning. Now, in terms of why they won, there was an ongoing fight before they arrived. In Afghanistan, there was a very hot conflict between ethnic militias that was a stalemate. No side could win. They had been fighting for years, just horrifying casualties, horrifying levels of violence, and it was a stalemate. Out of nowhere, a brand new jihadist movement emerged. That was the Taliban movement in the 1990s, and very quickly, within 2 years, had 90% of the countryside. In Somalia, it was equally sudden and dramatic in that there was a civil war from 1991 onwards. There are clan militias that had control over the entire Somali countryside, stalemate. Nobody could get decisive military victory. And then in 2006, a new movement, an Islamist movement that had an armed wing, so we can categorize it as a jihadist movement. Quickly, in 6 months, they took the country. And so when I say that this book looked at the origin stories, I was really asking, why is it out of all of these other competitors, jihadists are winning? And they're not just winning in some microcosm, like they're winning and taking the entire country, rebuilding the state in their image. In places that we like to call ungovernable, they govern. And when they create these states, or what I call in the book proto states, they're the closest thing to state like order that we've seen in these parts of the world in a long time. And so my book asked about that question about why jihadists were winning. And I'm a political economist of civil wars. And so I follow the money. You can see here the subtitle, Black Markets and Islamist Power. And so what I do in this book is I uncover a hidden economic logic that everybody overlooked. Everyone sees the big, hot, fiery rhetoric of, okay, the jihadists are winning because they've got so much fervor and so much passion for their cause. Well, at the end of the day, you can feel whatever you want, but war is very expensive. And if you do not have money to buy the bullet that goes in the gun, you are not going to win, full stop. And so a lot of my work going into this book was to uncover how it was they were able to do what no other peer competitors were able to do at that time. And what I found was that they had a remarkable way of courting local business support, people who were sick and tired of having to pay into this clan warlord and this ethnic militia that were all divided. They bought into one singular Islamist protection racket, one that cut across all of those other ethnic and tribal divisions and allowed, through that buy-in, those groups to monopolize the use of force. They literally created a security monopoly at these sudden and spectacular intervals. 1994 to 96 for the Taliban. Really, it was 94 that was instrumental in tipping the balance of power, and 2006 in Somalia. And that monopoly on having a security mafia gave these groups also the ability to monopolize by monopolizing force. Oh, no, we don't want that. No. Thank you. Okay. Let's hope that stays gone. So by monopolizing force, they created a state, because we know from the Weberian definition of statehood that a state is essentially a monopoly on the use of force. And so that's what I discovered at that early form of my research in looking at the origin stories of these jihadist movements. But that's not what I'm going to talk to you about today, because the fact is, I have been doing this work, tracking these processes for a very long time, or at least in my world, what I think is a very long time. But jihadists just keep winning. Despite all our efforts over the past decade, 2 decades, they are still winning. And I am deeply, deeply upset by what happened in Afghanistan in 2021. And I think we all are. And what happened was Canada's longest ever military engagement, the Americans' longest ever military engagement, NATO's biggest mission, $1 trillion and countless lives, and it was a catastrophic failure. And so what happened is the Taliban, that were the object to be overthrown, to be held back, to be, as was expected in 2002, to be crushed and pushed out of power, they came back like that, faster than when they won in the 1990s, faster, more robustly, despite extraordinary international effort and resources to prevent that from happening. And so I think as Canadians, as human beings who have witnessed this happen, there is a collective sense of not just failure or defeat, but just deep sadness as to how this could have happened. What on earth was that for? And as we have seen more recently, it started with the banning of girls' education at the high school level. Just this past December, our peers at the university level, our women peers at the university level, have also now lost their positions, their opportunities for continued study. And it feels as though everything that was done to bring about a different outcome in Afghanistan, that we are not just back to square one, but 0, -1, -5. Like there's a feeling of terrible, terrible regress. And what I will say is that there has been talk. I continue to work on these conflicts and on these issues. And so I have continued to try to engage with governments and militaries. Militaries are now pulled out, but governments, what is their responsibility at this time? And I remember being in Ottawa just a short while ago and speaking to some senior colleagues who said, Aisha, you do know that there is Afghanistan fatigue now in Ottawa. There's fatigue. And I'm like, okay, well, feelings of fatigue do not abdicate our responsibility to these people in this situation that we have helped co-create. The outcome that we are looking at here is not something that happened in a vacuum. It is not something that is indigenous and natural to Afghanistan. Everything that exists in Afghanistan today is the product of 4 decades of warfare. The fact that the gentleman here, the Taliban, on what I see as the left of my screen, that they probably can't read, and that the women on the right of my screen here are being denied the ability that they have gained to read. This is something that has been co-constructed over the course of a very long war. And Canada, in having partaken and participated in that long war, therefore plays a role in constructing the outcomes we see today. But the question is, was this outcome inevitable? And I will say to you that it was most certainly not inevitable. That while the situation that we found ourselves in the early 2000s was very fraught and very difficult, the outcome that we have now found ourselves with in Afghanistan was not inevitable. And I will begin by telling you that it was in 2004 and 2005 that the Taliban had been pushed from power in Afghanistan during that early phase of the war, where what the Americans did, there were some strategic decisions that were made in 2002 that rendered the outcome very fraught. And that was that instead of putting a large number of boots on the ground, because apparently going to Iraq was on the agenda, but instead of doing that, there was a delegation of war to other non-state actors, the ethnic warlords that I was talking about in the middle of that civil war. We just gave money and guns to that collection of ethnic warlords that had lost to the Taliban in the 1990s. They called themselves the Northern Alliance. They became foundational to the subsequent Afghan government. And so we set in motion a government that was essentially run by warlords that had reputations for and records of engaging in ethnogenocidal violence, wartime rape, the works. And some of the worst of them stayed the course right up until the Americans pulled out in August 2021. General Dosam. I'm always going to say his name. Now, what are the Canadians doing up there? Well, we took on the mission in Afghanistan, the Kandahar mission. I think the decision was in 2005, but it really picked up in 2006. And that was at a time when, after that initial push with the US and NATO entering into Afghanistan, the Taliban were on their heels. It was probably their lowest point in their power. And it was at that time that I took the initiative with a very small number of colleagues to identify how a back channel negotiation could be opened with the Taliban at that time, at the lowest point of their power, when they were more amenable to negotiated settlement. And everybody on this screen and a bunch of people more called that decision, or anyone who dared say negotiate now because it's the best time to negotiate, called that being a terrorist sympathizer. And in fact, it was only Jack Layton, whose photo I don't have here, but bless you, Jack. It was only Jack Layton who, after closed door meetings, and folks up here weren't even interested in having those meetings, came out and said, you know what, now is a good time to do that. And he got called Taliban Jack. And the efforts that went into identifying how it could be done at that time, when they were at the lowest of their power, were very tough, but they were possible. And people in power said no, until a negotiation happened at the point of pretty much military failure, when the Taliban were at the height of their resurging power, and we had lost all hand by signaling withdrawal. And so 15 years later, after that opportunity could have been seized upon, and everybody in that 15 years who had expended life and limb for an outcome that is worse than what we could have achieved in 2005. This was not inevitable. And I think it's critically important to talk about that, because if there is a lesson we can learn from this time of critical reflection, this time of feeling that sadness in failure, it is that we cannot let ego, bravado, ideology, image prevent us from doing rational and strategic analyses of what is the safest and best thing for world security. I have no time of day for sound bites or platitudes coming out of the mouths of any elected officials. The job of international peace and security is not to own your rival on the news. It is to do the humble, quiet, grueling, gut-wrenching, and sickening work of learning how to talk to your enemy so you can bring about a world with less violence, catastrophe, death. That was a missed opportunity, and it's on us to make sure that that missed opportunity doesn't repeat itself, because we're so prone to forget. So it was not inevitable. And indeed, what happened, this outcome that was not inevitable and that is dire, it matters because other groups are watching. It is very important to realize that Afghanistan, being sort of the original jihadist success story in establishing a jihadist proto-state, that it has resonance for other conflict zones around the world. Somalia with Al-Shabaab, Mali with JNIM, Boko Haram in Nigeria, always a little bit of a wild card, but there's also the Islamic State in West Africa province, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, and many others. What they have learned from watching this is that in the long run, you're going to get this, you know, and that there is an example of military victory over a superpower. So hang in there, keep fighting. It matters because other jihadist movements around the world have witnessed what happened in Afghanistan. So how could this happen? How could this possibly happen? The United States and NATO had overwhelming military superiority. And you might be thinking, okay, when it comes to planes and ships, of course, that's conventional military technology. But I can also tell you that for 2 decades, there was an immense investment in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism strategy and technology. An enormous amount of effort dedicated towards trying to prevent this exact outcome. And so how does it still happen that a small, weak, poorly equipped, non-state armed group survived 2 decades of assaults and then quickly, faster than in the original instance, retook the entire country? How does that happen? Now, there is a saying, it's a Taliban idiom that says the Americans have all the watches, but we have all the time. And they said that for 2 decades. And this was about, it was known, the Americans knew about this saying. And so it was this idea of, okay, well, are they just going to wait us out? Because they live there, they're not going anywhere else. So they're just going to try to wait us out. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is not just about waiting them out, but about what that long-term strategy was, what playing the long game looked like and meant for a group like the Taliban and what it can mean for others. All good. You're okay. It's okay. So we're going to talk this project that I'm going to present to you, which is sort of the next generation of research after my book, Jihad and Company. And I'm just going to give you a little amuse-bouche of the social science. We're not going to go too heavy duty into it, but the work itself that I'm going to present to you today has been published in the Journal of Global Security Studies. And so you have access to the full journal plus the appendix with all of the supplementary cases. If you are in fact interested in the main course of the research, you are welcome to read that. But I'll give you a little snapshot of what that looks like. And it really starts through an observation in the same way that I had observed the Taliban movement taking over very quickly in the 1990s, the same way I had observed the Islamic Courts Union taking over very quickly. I had also noticed a phenomenon in multiple conflict zones around the world, which is that jihadist insurgencies, they're able to resurge and reclaim power even after these seeming defeats. And so post 9/11, there was a strong push that whenever these sorts of movements came in, there was a hard, internationally led military intervention to get rid of them. And usually, with overwhelming military force, they would be ousted and they would appear to be gone for some time, or they would appear to be in a state of significant decline. And yet, repeatedly, over and over, like a wave, we saw them come back, reclaim power, sometimes suddenly and spectacularly in ways that we would have imagined that if you had gotten hit that hard, you should be out for the count. So that continuing to happen in multiple theaters, Iraq, Mali, we've seen it in Somalia, which is the case I'll present to you today, and of course in Afghanistan, Pakistan, multiple theaters of operation. And yet it appeared that no matter how strong the external military action was against them, that the only thing that that military action seemed capable of doing was changing the group's behavior. We could morph them from one form to another, but we couldn't make them go away. And so I saw this happen in many theaters. And so my observations were that I saw that jihadists can survive and resurge even after they lose territory, even after they're no longer able to govern. And over time, they continue to switch back and forth from being these sort of stateless insurgents, that are using hit and run attacks, classic forms of terrorism, classic guerrilla insurgency, and then at other times playing the role of shadow governors, acting as though they rule and are providing law and order. So I observed this in multiple cases, and that led to the question of why are they doing this? Why are they morphing in this way? And how does this behavior affect their survival? So that's really where the entry point was into this new phenomenon of jihadist durability. And so the question then, why are they resilient? What makes them resilient? Now, knee-jerk reaction, especially the one that they'd like you to believe, is that it has to do with their ideology. Their resilience is because of their faith. God is on their side because they believe so strongly. That's the reason that they're able to keep coming back. But as I've said, you can believe whatever you want, but if you don't have money to feed your foot soldiers and bullets to go in the guns, then you're gone. You're nothing. And so, how are they able to do this? And what I've done in this phase of the work is examine a hidden economic story about what they've been doing over these past 20 years. Mm-hmm. My first round of research in my book was about this critical economic relationship that they formed during their original rise to power. And I knew that that was absolutely instrumental in them being able to fund their blitz campaign to take over the country. That happened, and then they got, knocked down by an external intervention. So what is the story of why they're able to stay alive? How can we follow the money in that regard? And so I uncovered with this transformation of like rising to power and dropping from power and then rising to power and again, type of boom bust logic behind their resilience. And so what they've learned, this is learned behavior to survive these overwhelming military assaults. They have learned when and how to pull back, shifting to low-cost insurgent attacks. And to do so, they must have an adaptive economic strategy that allows them to stay solvent when they are in a state of decline, and also protects their assets. Because even if you stay solvent as a low-cost insurgent group, sure, you can do that on the cheap for a long period of time. That's not enough money to fuel your blitz. You need to have more stored assets than that. And so the strategy must accomplish two goals. It must keep your movement solvent during that period of decline so that you can remain relevant in the war theater, and it must protect sufficient assets to finance your future return to power. And what I have discovered in tracking the money is that this economic strategy, it is learned. It's learned through mistakes from other conflict zones as well. You watch somebody else lost far too many of their resources, you learn not to make that mistake. So it's been learned, refined, and sophisticated, built over time, and has become highly effective. There is an entire world of counterterrorism in financing specifically that aims at preventing jihadists from getting money from like covert donors, you know, in a desert somewhere who maybe want to send, you know, $40 million illicitly through illicit channels. This is a very different kind of jihadist financing that isn't about reliance on foreign donors or transnational networks. This is about becoming economically resilient in the face of tremendous external pressure, resilient and indeed independent of those sorts of external donors. Not to say that there aren't external donors and that there aren't even state sponsors, but indeed these groups have worked on developing their own economic strategy so that they can go the distance. Now, I'm going to present to you two hypotheses, one about the boom, one about the bust. And the independent variable, we're going to do a little social science amuse-bouche, is about it's the external pressure, the level of whether or not we're surging and going hard and fighting against jihadists, or whether or not we're thinking about withdrawal in America first, you know? So level of external pressure. And that external pressure determines, like, how much pressure are you under? It's going to determine your economic strategy. And the economic strategy that you employ will determine whether or not you're interested in governance or whether or not you're just going to pull back and keep doing those hit and run attacks. So your degree of governance. And what I contend is that jihadist insurgents adapt their economic strategies in response to varying degrees of external military pressure, which subsequently affects how much they can, will, invest in governance during their fight. So when there's external military pressure that's particularly high, that's a bust period. That means you're going to tighten your belt, trim down the fat, and get into insurgent fighting mode. So when external military pressure is high, jihadists withdraw from the territory that they control, and they invest their accumulated cash resources into businesses. So this is the key part where as I said, it's not just about foreign donors. They themselves invest their cash resources into businesses that pay a return. So you need that to pay dividends while you are engaged in the low-cost, high-impact game of insurgency and terrorism. This means that you're going to reduce how much you're taxing and governing. Now, just to be clear, governance is expensive, but when you govern, you can tax everybody, so you can make a lot more money. Insurgency is cheap, but not free. And so indeed, when you're engaged in insurgent tactics, you want to store your money and then maybe live off of some of the returns on that investment. That's when the external military pressure is high, because in these asymmetric conflicts, when you have a massive power imbalance against who you're fighting, you're not going to win in a head-on competition. What you need to do, your job isn't to win at that point. Your job is to not lose. Your job is to survive it and just to stay in the game, drain and frustrate your opponent until they get fed up. And then when they get fed up, they may back off. And then when that external military pressure is low, what you do is you cash out your invested resources to finance your surge. Because otherwise, if you've just been living off of the drippings, if you haven't done that with your cash resources, then you don't have enough money to finance the surge. You're still in insurgent mode. But if you have followed the strategy effectively and have in fact invested your resources in an intelligent way, then you can cash out, liquidate those resources, and invest in the surge that you need to reclaim territory. Once you have that territory, that's when you start engaging in taxation once again, and you can govern like a state. Now, this is what this used to look like, which is that you go in a cycle, because after that boom happens again and you're like, haha, I've now recaptured the state and I'm governing, the international community would once again get scared of you. And that fear right here leads to the troop surge. And then that troop surge, because, okay, here comes the bust. Here comes that strong external military pressure that results in a withdrawal from territory and investment in business, which pays dividends, which will finance your insurgency. You can do that for the long duration until your troops get exhausted and you want to go through another withdrawal. Then you have a boom because you liquidate your resources again, reclaim your territory, resume taxation, taxes pay for your little jihadist proto-state. But oh no, the international community is scared again. Let's have a surge. And so we would just keep doing this over and over and over and over. And it could theoretically go on indefinitely, except when you stop. But this is your formula for just riding that wave and playing the game for the long haul, where you don't go bankrupt and you can keep rising to power when the external military pressure abates. Now, how did I test this? I've talked to you a lot about Afghanistan. I'm going to present to you some information about the Somali case, but the Somali case is illustrated in great detail in the article that I referenced if you are interested. And as I said, enjoying the main course of this research. But the methods that I used were for that paper within case variation over time using a most similar systems design. And Somalia was a particularly good case because we have had a jihadist insurgency there from 2000 and let's say 2006 onwards, in which there have been waves of external military pressure, and then it's backed off, and then, oh no, another wave. And so we've got over a decade of evidence in which Al-Shabaab, the jihadist movement in Somalia, has gone through waves of governing like the state. And in fact, today, right now, today, the vast majority of the countryside is still held by Al-Shabaab that governs more effectively on some key metrics than the official Somali government does. And in fact, I have another paper that I co-authored with a couple of wonderful students at the University of Toronto. That was a fun experience, but it's called Who Governs? And it compares jihadist versus official state governance in Somalia. And the Somali official government has lost out in terms of, in that comparison of key performance metrics vis-a-vis Al-Shabaab that has outperformed the state. But all that's to say is that you'll see that Al-Shabaab has engaged in high levels of governance. It has its own courts, it issues its own laws, it rules over society, it taxes the heck out of people. But we've seen variation in how much it governs and doesn't govern over time. And so it was a perfect opportunity to do a tracing of these booms and busts over a period of a decade, looking at how it corresponds with surges and withdrawals of external military support. And then if you're interested, there's an appendix to that article that has supplementary case material from other cases, including Iraq and others. And then there will be a future book that comes out of this because, you know, it's like the sequel to Jihad and Company. And so there is an element of external validity through the supplementary materials. Now, I'll just give you a summary of what the findings are as opposed to, you know, the detailed analysis, but there have been surges in when the United States-led Ethiopian invasion was the first. Then it was an African Union surge in military operations. There was another one in which the Kenyans really tried to push Al-Shabaab out of Kismayo. And so we've seen repeated periods of busts that were immediately followed by a shift towards insurgency where they told their foot soldiers, okay, you're free to go. We can't pay you right now. We're going to keep our reduced core. And then massive spike in terrorist operations that immediately followed the loss of territory and the loss of governance. And so there was a pattern that increases and decreases in external military pressure prompted jihadists to change their behavior. And once I went a little further past that obvious correlation, it was also a specific shift in their economic strategies. Now, there was a surprising finding that jihadists managed over time to find a way to tax citizens even when they didn't have control over their territory. So, Al-Shabaab today taxes in the heart of government-held Mogadishu, and you can refuse to pay your state taxes, but you cannot refuse to pay Al-Shabaab's taxes. They will assassinate you if you refuse to pay. And their level of intelligence and infiltration into the society is so advanced that they know how much you owe down to the dollar point. They'll call you on the phone and say, you owe us this much. So there's insight into your economic, like if you run a business, for example, and so the size and scope of your business so that they can calculate your tax burden. And they have ways of demonstrating that they are who they say they are. So you can verify that you're paying your taxes to the right illicit group. But indeed, they have learned even to develop their coercive abilities to extract resources, which once again lends itself towards that learning and development of a sophisticated economic strategy. But indeed, what we did see is that after, for example, the fall of Kismayo, Kismayo was bringing in tens of millions of dollars of taxation revenue for Al-Shabaab. And then the Kenyans pushed Al-Shabaab, Kenyans and African Union pushed Al-Shabaab out of Kismayo. And now I did mention there was an immediate spike in terrorist activity that followed a change in strategy, but it was also at that time that we saw covertly the investment of those resources in businesses across the Horn of Africa and in fact other parts of the African continent as well, businesses that would produce dividends over the long course of that jihad. And so the summary of results, and as I said, I invite you to read the papers, that changes in external military pressure caused jihadists to shift from proto-state to insurgency. They would come up and they would govern in some places, and then when they were pushed back, they would shift to insurgents and insurgent-style attacks. And then when the pressure abated, they would come back again. And so external pressure could change these groups, but it could not eliminate them entirely. What are the implications of this? What are the consequences? So what this means is that external pressure affects jihadist strategy. So does withdrawal of that pressure. And that brings us to what we were talking about in the Afghanistan case. That may happen again. Because the fact is the world has changed a great deal since 2001. In 2001, if you wanted to study international security, jihadist insurgencies and the threat that they pose, terrorism was a hot new topic that was it filled the journals in international security. Counterinsurgency became, a central concern for folks at the Pentagon, folks in Ottawa, DND. This photo of U.S. withdrawal, August 2021. I believe it was just 2 months later that China launched its hypersonic missile test. Hypersonic missiles that prior to that test launch, the United States, there were, scholars at Carnegie there was a perception that the development of hypersonic missile technology was a new frontier of an arms race, but that all three, the United States, Russia, and China, were sort of at comparable levels of development. And then the Chinese launched hypersonic missiles, demonstrating their capabilities, which the Pentagon referred to, some at the Pentagon referred to as a Sputnik moment, a Sputnik-like moment, where there was immediate fear that the United States had fallen terribly behind in these capabilities. Some said as far as 15 years behind the Chinese technological development. And there was this realization in the immediate aftermath of the Afghanistan withdrawal that that effort put into counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, that specialization that had been focused on for 2 decades, had taken attention off of emerging peer competitors. And the fact is that we are now looking at a change in the balance of power in the system. Russia trying to be relevant via its war in Ukraine. If it loses that war, it's out of the superpower competition. If it's successful in its mission, we may be looking at a system of multipolarity. There is a perception already that we are in an emerging bipolar system with China as the dominant peer competitor. And so what that means is that the national security priorities in the United States and NATO, other allied nations, have changed. They have very much changed. And so what does that mean for jihadist movements in other parts of the world, where they see maybe we're not going to be so important to you anymore, and so that external military pressure could withdraw. Now, that doesn't mean that they'll get an easy victory, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, but there is a perception that the United States doesn't really care about this phenomenon anymore. And what I've shown from the model is that the withdrawal of that pressure does matter. So the US and NATO may not want to dedicate these resources to jihadists, given that there are great power competition considerations at play. But what would the consequence be of that withdrawal? Well, let's take a look once again at that cycle, that never-ending, terrible cycle of violence. Well, if in fact the jihadist proto-state, has no fear of a troop surge, then this part of the model does not need to happen. So essentially, if you end up with exhaustion leading to troop withdrawal, you get a boom, you reclaim territory, resume your taxation, rebuild a proto-state which functionally becomes a state, and if there's no external pressure to push it out of power, then we just stay here as a new equilibrium. And so the emergence of these jihadist proto-states functionally means the formation of new jihadist regimes. So the cycle can be broken, but if it's broken, it resolves at this level, where the only people who are smiling are those groups that were fighting for an extended period of time. So what does this mean for the future? If external pressures remove, the model predicts, and that model was published in the article that I make reference to, before the Taliban came to power. It was about 9 months before the Taliban came to power that that piece was published, but the model predicts a jihadist takeover, just as we saw in Afghanistan. It is possible, not inevitable. Even the case that we looked at was not inevitable, but it is possible that jihadists in other countries will win if international pressure against them abates. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States is the only player that determines this outcome, the United States and its allies. Of course, France has withdrawn from the Malian theater, where there is an active jihadist insurgency led by JNIM, but there's also the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. France withdrew because Mali had a coup d'etat, moving it from being a democracy to a dictatorship. Relations between France and Mali deteriorated terribly. There's still a UN mission. It's contentious, and I hope that it survives this political turmoil. But since that time, since the French have withdrawn, and in fact, even before the French had withdrawn, this expedited their withdrawal, the Malian regime turned to Russia and invited the Wagner Group, to come into Mali to fight against these jihadists, thinking, well, you'll roll up your sleeves and do the dirty work that no one else will do. So the US no longer being the sole power in the international system, it is possible that Russia and China will engage in these theaters as well, in what appears to be an emerging Cold War 2.0 style competition. And it's possible that Russia, for example, may side with authoritarian states that it believes will pivot in its interests. And there may be other types of behaviors as well. We do know that Russia is very friendly with Iran, for example. Well, China has recently signed an oil deal with the Taliban government, not recognizing the Taliban government, but it has signaled that it's willing to do business, particularly with resource extraction. which, given how quickly that has happened, signals a possibility of uh, these types of emerging regimes having different options in the international system. Now, what have we done? We have economically sanctioned the heck out of Afghanistan. And so far, those sanctions have demonstrated that they can hurt civilians, but they have done absolutely nothing to reduce the power of the Taliban regime. Not a damn thing. And so the instruments that we are using today in terms of economic sanctions are significantly weaker than any military instruments that we've used, and thus even less effective than the instruments that we've used historically. So now what? I have told you a very dark story, and it has ended with what appears to be failure, a resolution of conflict in the exact opposite way that we have envisioned it. And I have told you about a long jihad, a long jihad. And what I'd like to say to you is that no matter what folks in Ottawa say about Afghanistan fatigue, people not wanting to talk about it anymore, being preoccupied with other international security considerations, that despite all of that, this is not over. This is most certainly not over. And one important learning that I have had from this, in learning about how this phenomenon of jihadist uprisings is it's not something that, even though we see it as happening quickly and spontaneously, it is a long process of transformation that has deep roots, old roots in enduring conflicts. What that has also taught me is patience and understanding that, in fact, if this story is not going to be over, then I also need to have all the time. I need to have all the time. It's not only the Taliban who can have all the time, I can have all the time too. And so when I tell you that it's not over, in what ways is this not over? It is, of course, understandable to feel that this is a dark time for these parts of the world, and the people whom indeed must feel abandoned. But here are the things that I think are hopeful, that I think are still possible. What we've seen in Afghanistan today is not a return to a time, a historical time. This isn't a natural state of Afghanistan, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. This is a new modern phenomenon. The Taliban are a modern phenomenon born out of 4 decades of violence, a movement that we co-constructed through our actions. And so as we co-construct our world, I am called to do 2 things. First, hardest, most challenging, is I am called to understand them. That is a talk that I give separately at different times, called Understanding Enemies. But the fact of the matter is, if we were supposed to talk to them in 2005, we still have to talk to them today in 2022. And in so doing, understand how they see the world, how this war has co-constructed their reality, how they understand the future of their country, how they understand themselves and threats that they're facing. And the way to do that is to start with the presupposition that nobody thinks that they're the villain in the story. Everybody is the protagonist in their own story. Everybody's the hero in their own story. Nobody thinks they're there twirling their mustache doing evil in the world. And so how do we understand these people? And it is only through that deep understanding that true, beneficial talks, negotiations, and inclusion back into an international community is even remotely possible. And if we do not do that, we are condemning not just that regime, but every man, woman, and child that we claimed to help for 20 years to a North Korea-like existence. And so it is imperative for us to do the difficult work of managing our hurt elsewhere and engaging with the exact actor that we deemed to be an enemy to find a way out of this that isn't full of despair. And second, and this is just personal for me, but I will share it with you, the senior college. We cannot claim to care about these people and about the values that we espoused for 2 decades, and then allow for the libraries and the universities to be shut off for half of the population. And so, while I will not give anything away here while we're recording, it is imperative for us in times like this to stand firm on those principles for Afghan women, for Afghan students who have been shown the light of a university, which each of us have been shown. Each and every one of us, we know what that's like when you first gain access to an unlimited library, more books than you could ever read, and what that does to you. It brings you into kinship with the entire world. And so it's not over if we remember them and we do courageous action to keep that light on. So it's not over for me, and it shouldn't be over for any of us. And we certainly shouldn't let any of our elected officials think that we've forgotten. I'll close by just saying that, I have a great number of loved ones who are in the Canadian Armed Forces and whose feelings about this I will not even dare to speak about. But I do think that we honor all of the sacrifices and the gifts that were given, of life and limb, by ensuring that we do not accept this to be the end of the story, and that the work moving forward is to remember that once again, this is a long story, and the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend towards justice. I think that's all I've got for you. Thanks for listening.